Another aspect to the civil rights movement was actually the Black Power movement. So we're going to see that right after World War II, cities have this upbeat image. But by the time we're getting to like the 1970s, we're seeing a lot more slums and just squalid back streets, especially in like popular imagery, like in movies and TV. And a lot of this is because we have this urban crisis basically going on at this time period. Um, the thing is, a lot of Americans are going to feel uncomfortable with their cities by this point. And there's this assumption that a lot of urban problems were growing pains, that there just needed to be a lot more money put into the streets, the schools, like the sewer systems, things like that. And the problems with a lot of cities was just that you have a lot of domestic poor living in the cities, and a lot of them are living on like welfare. And so they needed schools for like education, and they needed a lot of times like more social work agencies and such to help with the socioeconomic issues. And a lot of these individuals had no access to like real health care, and so basically they wouldn't go into the doctor very often. And so when they do get treated, it would be in like hospital emergency rooms, which just makes the problem unfortunately worse because it's just so expensive. So we get a lot of these urban problems in cities are really associated with African Americans that are living in these cities. A lot of this comes back to work. A lot of African Americans couldn't get jobs in the cities, especially like in the north, because there were industrial layoffs and plant closures, especially once you get to like the 1970s. And then in the south, they're losing out on opportunities of work because you get mechanization, specifically in like agriculture. And so what happens is these African Americans oftentimes are caught up in these decaying neighborhoods that are victimized by crime. And so we're seeing the streets get increasingly violent, especially with like the spread of handguns, and then like when we're getting into illegal drugs, which we're going to talk about later and everything. And so on top of that, we're getting a lot of central cities having financial problems because now roads, bridges, fire stations, etc. are about 50 to 100 years old, and so that means they're starting to wear out and need to be replaced. And so this means higher taxes. The American system also at this time was that local government should basically take care of themselves. And so a lot of times cities are going to pay twice the amount of like state and local taxes compared to like an average suburbanite. All of these issues are basically going to lead to what is called the urban riots, basically during the 1960s. Now, I hate to use the term riot because that's a very one-dimensional vocabulary term that sounds like one side is attacking. And the reality of the situation was there was so much more to it. So on one hand, you're seeing African Americans, Hispanics, just minorities in general, who are rioting in these city streets in the mid 60s, are doing so because they're fed up with things like lack of job opportunities, substandard housing, and the crime in their neighborhoods. And so you have this mounting anger. But it's also more complicated than that because some of this actually comes down to other issues of things like white supremacy and authority and etc. Because we have things like Johnson is going to implement a plan that he has these local action initiatives known as CAPS, which were community action programs. And these is all about his anti-poverty package and everything, which is pushing through more of Kennedy's original ideas. And so it was about combating poverty in individual communities. But specifically, they're going to place a lot of times local like Black leaders in charge of these kinds of programs. Because a lot of times the African American community is one of the poorest. So it makes sense that they want to give them a say in these kinds of initiatives. However, unfortunately, this oftentimes drew resentment from other groups, especially like local white politicians or members of police forces. And this resentment oftentimes resulted in things like official toleration of acts of police officers, basically police brutality against African Americans. Oftentimes this behavior goes unpunished. And so this is just one more thing that frustrated and angered a lot of the African American population. And so this is one more thing that pushed them to violently lash out. And so a lot of times these riots aren't necessarily initiated by minority communities, even though they're considered in textbooks, they call them like the urban riots of the 60s, or a lot of times they'll call them like the race riots of the 60s and everything like that. And that sounds like it's very much, when we hear the term rioting, it is automatically has a negative connotation, when this situation was a lot more complicated, that they're lashing out sometimes to try to protect themselves from these issues of like corruption, so to speak. And so we get these so-called riots in places like Rochester, Harlem, Brooklyn. Basically, we're going to get these kinds of riots scarring most of the big cities by the time we're through with, especially like the 70s. It's not always going to be African Americans. In other places, like it would be like Puerto Ricans in Chicago, for example. This violence and how it is portrayed very much frightens a lot of white Americans, because previous race riots, basically white people had used violence specifically to keep black people in their place. And so they're going to try to be doing that all the same. A lot of times when you do have black people instigating these riots, their primary targets were like police and different businesses that had a reputation for exploiting customers, specifically African American customers. And so a lot of these riots and protests were about the problems of city life. The thing is, we get deaths because of these across America, and very few politicians wanted to admit African Americans and Hispanics had serious grievances. There were serious problems that needed to be fixed. But politicians didn't want to talk about that. Instead, they would like blame outside forces and say, oh, outsiders are coming into the cities and initiating these riots. And quite frankly, that wasn't true. Most of the participants in these kind of protests were neighborhood residents. Despite all of the gains of the civil rights, unemployment is still high, and police officers still treated African Americans as potential criminals. Which is when we need to talk about other parts of the civil rights movement, such as self-determination. There is going to be a minority within the black community that wanted absolute separatism, but a lot of them are going to be demanding self-determination. And so a lot of these is tapping into the same kind of anger that fuels the urban riots and even the civil rights movement. And so this brings about the idea of the Black Power movement. And so this is challenging, actually, the goal of the civil rights movement, which was seeking full integration and participation in American society, and basically giving an alternative to that. So when we're looking at the Black Power movement, it's actually larger than the civil rights movement. You could say the civil rights movement was almost a part of the Black Power movement, because the Black Power movement, sometimes individuals joining in this movement, their goals were for civil rights. Other times it was things about like cultural pride. And then others would take it even further with wanting like revolutionary separatism. A lot of it was about efforts by minorities to basically define themselves through their own heritage, through their own background, not by living up to what white society's expectations of them were. Now, the expressions of the Black Power movement is going to translate into many different ways. Sometimes it was individuals wanted to control one's own community through like the voting machine, being able to vote. Other times it was more about, the celebration of African American heritage. And then, like I said, the more separatist view is creating a parallel society that basically shuns white institutions. On a personal level, though, a lot of times the Black Power movement was basically synonymous for Black pride, an increase in understanding one's own cultural beliefs and being proud of one's own background. We're also going to see interests increasing in the Nation of Islam, which was basically Black Muslims. This very much was a version of Islam with radical separatism. So it was going to call for like self-discipline, supporting Black institutions and Black businesses, and just a total rejection of like white institutions and white businesses. It's going to appeal to a lot of individuals who felt like there was no future in integration. The strongest following in the Nation of Islam is going to be in like northern cities, and a big leader in this is going to be Malcolm X. Malcolm X is a really interesting individual in that so often while history books sanctify Martin Luther King Jr., they vilify Malcolm X. The thing is, he had been a streetwise criminal, but then he had gone to prison and he had converted to Islam there. He preached about Black people that they should stop letting white people set the terms in which they judge like their appearance or judge their communities or judge their accomplishments. He was a much more radical figure when we're looking at like civil rights across America. We don't know where he would have gone or what he eventually would have pushed for, though, because in the last year of his life, he actually returned from a pilgrimage to Mecca, and he was actually willing to consider limited acceptance of white people. However, rivals within his own movement actually assassinated him, and so we don't quite know where that would have gone, and that was in 1965. We also get the Black Panthers. They're going to pursue a lot of similar goals to like the Nation of Islam, as well as just the Black Power movement overall. They were actually created in 1966, and one of the big things that they're known for is they carried firearms openly. Basically, there was two parts of this. On one hand, this was asserting their equality as Americans and their right to bear arms, and it was a great way to protest gun control, basically. And the other part was that they would specifically shadow police patrols to prevent the mistreatment of African Americans. They are seen as a much more radical group when looking at the civil rights movement. I'm going to get a little bit more into that, but this is really important because on one hand, it pushes the civil rights movement to focus more on some of the inner city issues during this time period and not just focus on a lot of the suburban regions. And it also pushed a lot of Americans, while a lot of Americans were willing to accept the civil rights movement, they weren't necessarily ready to go as far as the Black Panthers would have wanted them when it came to like African American rights. And so there's this element of them being there helped push more Americans to actually accept the civil rights movement, because that was seen as less radical then compared to the Black Panthers. But that being said, the Black Panthers did a lot of other things. For instance, we see them like promote community-based like self-help efforts. It'd be things like they would help push free breakfast programs for like school children. They also pushed opening up like medical clinics. They ran political candidates as well. That's the thing, is they were very much pushing a political program. Unfortunately, this program would be shaken when Huey Newton, who actually started the Black Panthers with Bobby Seale, was convicted of manslaughter for killing a police officer, and basically Huey Newton had to flee to Algeria. The unfortunate thing is we also see different chapters of the Black Panthers basically implode, because what would happen is they would attract like thugs and shakedown artists as much as they attracted visionaries. Despite these issues, they would survive as a political party into the 1970s, but a lot of times they unfortunately get a bad rap in a lot of like books and memoirs and things like that, because you do have this element that did attract criminals into the organization. And a lot of people remember that and don't look at necessarily everything that they did and pushed for as well.